Welcome to Delaware County Political News. This is Larry DeMarco, your host.
Mariner East pipelines are in the news. You have been given a role of spokesperson for both your homeowners association and this Middletown Coalition for Community Safety. Is it safe?
Well, the word safe actually has no objective meaning. The more appropriate term to analyze when you're considering risk is the word risk.
What's the track record of this chemical in these pipelines?
Well, so I'll start with consequences first if I can. So there have been, unfortunately, many large releases of hazardous highly volatile liquids with ignition. And so we've seen the enormously damaging potential of these materials. There's one accident which I discussed in another video in which every building within a 3 square mile area was damaged by a delayed ignition highly volatile liquids accident. Frankly, in terms of looking at past accidents, to understand that the consequences of a large release of these materials can be catastrophic, especially in a densely populated area. Enormous quantities of extremely dangerous materials, consequences in the view of most people who have looked at this are off the scale. So what about the probability? The other element of risk. Sunoco, it turns out, has had more than 300 accidents from its pipeline systems just since 2006. And that number of accidents makes it not just an outlier in the pipeline industry, but an extreme outlier. It's right at the top in terms of numbers of accidents that it's had. It had an accident as recently as June of this year, right here in Delaware County. That same pipeline that leaked in June had leaked 3 other times in our neck of the woods. So Sunoco has had many, many accidents in southeast Pennsylvania and elsewhere on its pipeline systems. Probability is unfortunately way too high when you consider the record of this particular operator.
So how did Sunoco get the permission to build what they call Mariner East 1, which is in production or functioning as we speak right now?
Mariner East 1 is an ancient 8-inch 1930s era pipeline that's been reverse flowed to carry these materials from west to east. That pipeline has leaked 3 times in the space of less than a year in 2016 and 2017. The federal pipeline regulator issued what it calls an advisory bulletin about this practice. And what we know is that Sunoco did not fully comply with this advisory bulletin before putting what it calls Mariner East 1 into service.
Now they want to use a second pipeline. What do they have to do to get permission to do that?
2 things. They had to obtain the rights to a whole bunch of new land across Pennsylvania, particularly here in Delaware County. And they had to get environmental permits from the Department of Environmental Protection. Both of those things remain contested and under litigation.
They needed an easement or right-of-way over others' property. How did they obtain that?
You know what they really needed is they needed the ability to take people's property voluntarily or not. If they didn't obtain somehow, some way, the ability to take your property from you, it was going to be a difficult undertaking for them. So that was the first thing that they concentrated on. And the method that they used, to summarize it, they relied on very old certificates of public convenience that were issued in the 1930s to the company that built what is now called Mariner East 1. They, through a series of transactions, they acquired that company, and the Public Utility Commission allowed the transfer of that ancient certificate of public convenience to be transferred to Sunoco. Now, the important thing, I think, for your viewers to understand about these certificates is they were, and still today, are granted on a county-by-county basis, and they don't mention a particular project. So Sunoco was able to acquire what I'll just call a certificate of public convenience for the purpose of transporting petroleum products in Delaware County, for example. The courts have found, based on that certificate of public convenience, that Sunoco has the authority to take any property anywhere in Delaware County. And this is what I think people should be concerned about. If they're successful, if they succeed with this, they have quite literally laid claim to every square inch of Delaware County and every square inch of Chester County and every square inch of 15 other counties besides across Pennsylvania. If you add it up, it's something like 40% of Pennsylvania that Sunoco has laid claim to based on these ancient certificates of public convenience. There's something wrong with this system. You could argue that there's something missing here from a due process standpoint when a company says that their right to take your property was granted to them in 1930 and you have no authority, no right to object today, because if you wanted to do so, you should have done it then. This is the construct that the government of Pennsylvania has put in place.
First, did they apply for the new ones?
They did. At one point, they did apply for new certificates of public convenience for Mariner East 2. And a pair of administrative law judges at the Public Utility Commission found that the project didn't comply with the requirements to be granted a certificate of public convenience because of its very obvious export purpose. It wasn't for the benefit of Pennsylvanians, it was an export project, and that's how it was conceived at the beginning. Sunoco appealed that decision to the full Board of Commissioners of the PUC, who disagreed, found otherwise, and remanded it back to the ALJs for further proceedings, and at that point, Sunoco withdrew. And what Sunoco did instead is to say, we're just going to rely on these 1930s era certificates, and we think that that gives us all the authority that we need.
Was that challenged?
It was. It was challenged multiple times in multiple cases, and the courts, for their part, in particular the Common Pleas courts and the Commonwealth Court, found in a series of cases that it was okay for Sunoco to take my property or your property or anybody else's property in Delaware County because they had this certificate of public convenience. And the court didn't really examine the method by which it had been acquired. For them, it was just, well, they have a certificate. I guess the PUC thought that was okay. Who are we to quibble with that? And so there was a real dysfunction or a passing of the buck between the PUC and the courts that ended up with neither the PUC nor the courts fully having to take responsibility for the consequences of their combined actions. The highest responsibility of government has got to be to reasonably provide for the public safety. If you don't have that, there's not a whole lot else that matters. And the government of Pennsylvania has failed at every level to do that most basic function of government.
Let's discuss the levels. Let's discuss the top level, the executive branch.
As I mentioned earlier, Sunoco required permits to be issued by the Department of Environmental Protection. That's an executive branch agency. That entire matter is in fact under investigation by the Pennsylvania Ethics Commission right now. And it's not just any Ethics Commission investigation. It is a full investigation, which is fairly rare. I would suggest that the permits were improperly issued, and the evidence for that assertion is the dozens and dozens and dozens of construction accidents that Sunoco has had. But all of this was predictable in advance, right? The DEP should not be running a pay-to-pollute scheme. The DEP, in my view, should not improperly issue permits and then when the applicant violates those permits repeatedly, give a token slap on the wrist. There's something wrong with this whole construct and the way that the DEP has actually failed at the job that it is assigned.
Are you satisfied with the Public Utility Commission's role in stepping up to protect public safety?
I'm not. And the PUC is an inherently conflicted agency. Its statutory construct requires it to both protect public safety, but also to look out for the interests of the companies that it regulates. And so it's an inherently conflicted agency with a schizophrenic dual mandate. And I don't think that as a result of that dual mandate, it is simply unable to be fully responsible for the public safety, which should be its most important responsibility. The PUC commissioners themselves are also clearly conflicted. Most of the commissioners have close ties to the oil and gas industry or to the governor's office or both. I fear that the commissioners are also not operating independently or without bias as they're supposed to.
What did you observe concerning local commissioners and their relationship to protecting citizen property?
So what we saw is some townships completely abdicated on their duties to protect the public interests, and that actually didn't go over that well. And if you were paying attention to the races in 2017, a lot of municipal seats had incumbents removed along the pipeline route, all through Chester County and some in Delaware County as well, primarily on the basis of what those supervisors or commissioners had done or had not done to protect the people that they were charged with protecting. So Delaware County in 2012 commissioned at taxpayer expense a $200,000 economic study on the reuse of the old Sunoco refinery in Marcus Hook. Interestingly, this economic study only considered one option for the facility, and that involved the transportation to it of these hazardous, highly volatile liquids. Clearly, there were other potential uses for the property, but maybe it could have been a technology center, or it could have been an amusement park. I don't know. There were clearly other options that could have been considered, but Delaware County Council in 2012 had the taxpayers pay for a study that only considered one option, the option that Sunoco was interested in. I think what Sunoco really meant when they said they were going to create jobs is they meant they were going to create jobs for lawyers to take people's land away from them. And one manifestation of that, as we've seen, has been the head of the Delaware County GOP is a long time, has long represented Sunoco in legal matters, and the former chair of the Delaware County Democratic Party is a partner at a law firm that also represents Sunoco. In fact, a law firm that my homeowners association has battled repeatedly in court proceedings. Not a coincidence. So the conflicts of interest are everywhere that you look.
So let's talk about the courts now.
The earliest eminent domain cases that made its way to to Commonwealth Court is the case known as Martin, and it was a number of defendants who had had their property seized by Sunoco. And at the Commonwealth Court level, they lost, but there were two vigorous dissents to the taking. Perhaps two of the most conservative judges on Commonwealth Court, Judge Brobson and Judge McCullough, who vigorously objected to what they clearly viewed as an unconstitutional taking of private property. And look, private property is intensely important to Pennsylvanians. I would say it's intensely important to all Americans, but especially in Pennsylvania. People value their private property that they've worked hard to purchase, and in fact, it's right in Article 1, Section 1 of the Pennsylvania Constitution that you have a right to possess and defend property. It's heartbreaking, and it's wrong.
What advice would you have on how, as a citizen, you want your elected official to behave in the face of an energy company or any type of business that wants to build on private property?
First of all, we want to continue to provide information to the public. Most particularly, we want to provide the public with the information about the risk that's being imposed on them by Sunoco. We hope that elected officials will do a better job going forward at fulfilling their primary responsibility to provide for the public safety, and that includes township officials, county officials, and most especially the executive branch of government. Harry Truman famously said, "The buck stops here." But my call to action is, if you do not take steps to exercise the authority that you possess, you will not have my vote.